The laughter didn't sound cruel at first, just careless, the kind that slips out of polished mouths when they believe the room belongs to them, but when it landed on Daniel Brooks, it felt like a slap he wasn't allowed to react to. Beneath chandeliers brighter than anything he had seen in years, surrounded by people who wore confidence as naturally as they wore diamonds, Daniel stood still, his borrowed suit slightly tight at the shoulders, his fingers gripping a thin folder as if it were the last solid thing in a world made of glass. He had learned long ago that when you are poor and alone, reactions cost more than silence. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet strength of people who refuse to become bitter, take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because stories like this are meant to travel farther than judgment ever does. Daniel had not planned to attend a gala in a lifetime like his, not since grief had rewritten his future, not since his wife, Laura, slipped away in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and final promises. 3 years had passed since that night, 3 years of waking up before dawn, packing lunches, tying shoelaces, and pretending strength came naturally. Emma, his daughter, was 6 now, her laughter the only sound that could still soften the sharp edges inside him, and everything he did, every job he accepted, every pride he swallowed, was for her. Once, Daniel had been an aerospace engineer with patents in progress and colleagues who respected his mind, but grief is not a line item companies budget for, and when his performance slipped, so did his job security. The layoffs came politely, with handshakes and regret, and the world expected him to land on his feet without noticing that his feet were already sinking. He translated technical manuals at night, fixed broken machines during the day, and taught himself new languages the way others learned hobbies, because understanding words became his way of controlling chaos. The invitation to the gala had arrived late and without ceremony, an afterthought attached to a request from a non-profit that had discovered old technical documents written in multiple languages, documents Daniel had quietly translated for them over months without payment, because helping felt better than asking. He didn't expect recognition, he barely expected to be noticed. What he didn't expect was Victoria Hay. She stood near the center of the room like gravity itself, the CEO whose name was spoken with admiration and fear in equal measure, her success story polished and repeated so often it had become legend. When her eyes landed on Daniel, she didn't see a man, she saw an anomaly, someone who didn't fit the picture she believed success required. Her joke was sharp and public, a comment about charity invitations being mistaken for acceptance, about borrowed suits and borrowed importance, and the laughter followed her words like trained applause. Daniel felt the heat rise in his chest, the familiar mix of shame and anger he had learned to bury, and for a moment he thought of Emma asking him why some people were mean for no reason, and how he had struggled to answer without teaching her to hate the world. As the evening dragged on, impatience crept into the room when the host announced a problem with the planned presentation, explaining that the recovered documents tied to a failed international satellite project couldn't be verified because the experts were delayed. The project was rumored to hold technology that could change humanitarian response forever, but rumors mean nothing without clarity. Victoria, sensing an opportunity, turned inconvenience into spectacle, suggesting loudly that perhaps someone in the room claimed expertise enough to save the evening, her gaze deliberately finding Daniel again. The room's attention snapped toward him, curiosity now tinged with cruelty, and in that moment Daniel understood something clearly: this wasn't about him anymore. This was about whether silence would teach his daughter to stay small or whether courage, even clumsy and unwanted, could teach her something better. He walked forward with a steady pace that surprised even himself, the weight of his life pressing against his spine, and took the microphone, feeling the room hold its breath not in respect, but in anticipation of failure. Part 2. Daniel didn't defend himself or explain why he belonged there, because explanations are often invitations for dismissal, and he had learned that clarity spoke louder than history. He opened the folder and began calmly, outlining the project's original intent in precise English, his voice steady, his mind slipping into the familiar rhythm of problem-solving that had once defined him. Then he shifted into French without warning, addressing the European engineers referenced in the margins of the documents, explaining a misinterpretation that had stalled progress decades ago. The murmurs began, subtle at first, disbelief rippling through the audience as Daniel continued into German, correcting a propulsion calculation that had been politically buried rather than scientifically disproven. When he moved into Mandarin to explain supply chain failures tied to geopolitical pressure, phones rose, but even the act of recording felt secondary to the weight of the moment. Finally, he spoke Arabic, detailing a humanitarian application for the technology that had never been implemented, one that could provide emergency communication in disaster zones where silence often meant death. 5 languages flowed from him not as performance, but as survival, as nights spent translating while Emma slept beside him, her small hand resting on his arm as if anchoring him to the world. The laughter disappeared completely, replaced by a silence so thick it felt alive. Victoria's smile collapsed, not into anger, but into something more unsettling, the realization that power had limits she had never bothered to notice. Daniel finished not with flair, but with solutions, explaining how the project could be revived cheaply, how its failure had been a choice, not a flaw, and how the non-profit's mission aligned perfectly with what had been abandoned. Applause came slowly, then all at once, not polite or obligatory, but raw and rising, the sound of a room correcting itself. Board members whispered urgently, scholars stared as if seeing a ghost of integrity they had forgotten, and Daniel stepped away from the microphone, returning to the edge of the room, though the edge no longer existed for him. In the days that followed, calls came he never expected, meetings replaced odd jobs, and the non-profit rebuilt the project with Daniel not as a symbol, but as a leader. Media outlets wanted his story framed as revenge, but Daniel refused, insisting the focus remain on impact, on communities that would finally be heard when disaster struck. Victoria issued a public apology that sounded rehearsed, but her actions spoke louder when she funded the project fully and stepped aside, learning in discomfort that leadership sometimes begins with humility. At home, Emma noticed the change not in headlines, but in her father's posture, the way his shoulders no longer curved inward as if bracing for impact. Years later, when Emma stood confidently on a stage of her own, Daniel watched from the audience knowing that one night of humiliation had become a lesson that would echo far beyond a gala hall. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that kindness is strength and that dignity can outlast cruelty, please take a moment now to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach the people who need them most. And just before we end, we have one special request for you. Please comment below with the one lesson you took from Daniel's journey, because your words may inspire someone silently watching and struggling. The world will always have rooms where laughter cuts and lights blind, but it will also have quiet people carrying languages, losses, and love inside them, waiting for the moment when truth finally speaks loud enough to silence everything else.